Some mistakes don't end careers. They expose the truth hiding behind an entire system. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the grand marble atrium of the State Judicial Center, a sound so sharp that every nearby conversation stopped in an instant. Lawyers froze with folders tucked beneath their arms. Court clerks exchanged uneasy glances. Visitors instinctively stepped aside as Officer Daniel Brooks, a veteran patrol officer whose polished badge reflected the bright morning lights, stood with unwavering confidence beside a calm black woman dressed in a simple navy suit. Her silver hair framed a composed face untouched by panic, and despite the steel around her wrists, she carried herself with remarkable dignity. Daniel barely looked at her as he spoke in a firm voice that carried across the lobby. "You're under arrest for refusing to comply with a lawful investigation." His words sounded practiced, certain, and final. The woman neither argued nor pleaded. Instead, she quietly met his eyes with a calm expression that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Around them, whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Some assumed she must have crossed an important security boundary. Others believed she had ignored repeated instructions. No one seemed willing to question the officer's judgment. After all, a uniform often speaks louder than uncertainty. Daniel adjusted his radio and gestured toward the security desk, where several courthouse employees stood frozen, unsure whether they should intervene. "Ma'am," he continued, "you had multiple opportunities to identify yourself." The woman answered softly, her voice steady enough that only those nearest could hear. "Identity is not always recognized because of a badge." Daniel dismissed the remark with a faint smile that suggested he had heard every excuse imaginable during his years on the force. To him, the situation appeared simple. A woman had entered a restricted government corridor, questioned his authority, and refused to produce credentials in the manner he demanded. In his mind, procedure had been followed. The decision had already been made. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different. The courthouse security supervisor stood unusually still. A young judicial clerk glanced repeatedly toward the front entrance while quietly reaching for her phone. An older bailiff shifted uneasily, opening his mouth twice before deciding to remain silent. It was as though invisible currents were moving beneath the polished floors, unnoticed by the one man convinced he controlled the room. The woman slowly looked around the lobby, taking in the towering marble columns, the American flag standing proudly beside the state seal, and the portraits of distinguished judges lining the walls. Her expression revealed neither anger nor fear. It reflected patience, the kind earned through decades of experience inside institutions where appearances often shaped assumptions before facts ever had a chance to speak. Daniel tightened his grip on the paperwork in his hand and prepared to escort her toward the security office. "Let's go," he said. She nodded once without resistance. The silence surrounding them became heavier than any raised voice could have been. Somewhere outside, the distant sound of approaching vehicles rolled through the streets surrounding the Capitol complex. One courthouse employee looked through the glass entrance doors, her face suddenly losing all color. Another quietly whispered 3 words that no one else seemed ready to believe. Daniel never heard them. He remained focused on the arrest report already forming in his mind, completely unaware that within moments, one unexpected arrival would transform an ordinary Monday morning into a moment that every person inside that courthouse would remember for the rest of their lives. Officer Daniel Brooks guided the woman across the polished floor with measured steps, convinced that every eye watching confirmed he had done exactly what the law required. He did not notice the uncertainty spreading across the faces of courthouse employees who knew that something felt deeply wrong. The woman remained silent, her posture calm and composed, never attempting to pull away or argue. Even with handcuffs around her wrists, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that truth. Did not become weaker simply because others failed to recognize it. The heavy courtroom doors stood open as morning sunlight spilled through the towering windows, casting long reflections across the marble floor. Attorneys paused in the middle of conversations. Court reporters lowered their notebooks. A pair of law students whispered to one another, wondering who the unfamiliar woman could be. Daniel interpreted every stare as approval. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and those instincts had rarely been challenged in public. As they approached the security office, a courthouse administrator hurried toward them before slowing to an uncertain stop. His expression suggested that he wanted to speak, yet hesitation won the battle. Daniel noticed the man, but dismissed the moment with a brief nod that silently warned him not to interfere. The administrator stepped aside without another word. Behind him, a young judicial assistant quietly reached into her purse and pressed a speed dial contact on her phone, careful not to attract attention. The woman beside Daniel finally broke the silence. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, reading the name stitched across his uniform. "Every public servant eventually faces a moment that defines how history remembers them." Daniel responded without looking at her. "History is written after procedures are followed." She gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "Sometimes procedure is only the beginning of the story." Her answer lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. A veteran bailiff standing near the entrance lowered his head, recognizing her voice before recognizing her face. He had heard that calm, deliberate tone years earlier during one of the most significant judicial ceremonies of his career. His heartbeat quickened, but uncertainty held him in place. What if he was mistaken? What if speaking too soon only made matters worse? Across the lobby, courthouse security monitors displayed multiple camera angles capturing every second of the unfolding incident. A supervisor quietly instructed another employee to preserve the recordings without interruption. No alarms sounded. No one shouted. Yet the atmosphere continued to grow heavier, as though the building itself understood that an invisible line had already been crossed. Outside, several official vehicles entered the circular driveway one after another. Their arrival was orderly, almost routine, but unusual for an ordinary Monday morning. Drivers stepped out first, scanning the entrance before opening rear passenger doors. Staff members carrying folders moved quickly toward the building without speaking. Inside, Daniel reached the security office entrance and prepared the paperwork needed to complete the detention record. He believed the process would soon be over, another routine report added to years of service. He could not see the reflection in the glass doors behind him, where several courthouse officials had quietly gathered, their attention fixed not on the officer, but on the dignified woman standing beside him. The silence that surrounded them no longer felt uncertain. It felt expectant, as though every passing second was counting down toward a single moment capable of changing every assumption made that morning. The growing silence inside the security office was interrupted by the faint sound of polished shoes crossing the marble hallway outside. One by one, courthouse officials gathered near the entrance without speaking. Their expressions carried something far stronger than curiosity. It was concern. Officer Daniel Brooks noticed them only briefly before returning his attention to the paperwork spread across the desk. He filled in each line carefully, convinced that every action he had taken would withstand scrutiny. Across from him, the woman waited patiently, her hands resting comfortably despite the restraints around her wrists. She studied the framed photographs hanging on the office walls, images celebrating decades of judicial service, landmark rulings, and ceremonies honoring the rule of law. There was no frustration in her face, only quiet reflection, as though she had spent an entire lifetime witnessing moments exactly like this. A young deputy clerk finally gathered enough courage to approach the doorway. Her breathing was uneven as she looked first at the woman, then at Daniel. She opened her mouth to speak before stopping herself once again. Daniel noticed the hesitation and offered a confident smile. "Everything is under control," he assured her. She forced a polite nod, but her eyes never left the woman sitting calmly in the chair. The deputy clerk slowly backed away, immediately making another phone call the moment she stepped into the hallway. Meanwhile, the veteran bailiff who had recognized the woman's voice could no longer ignore the growing certainty forming in his mind. He quietly walked toward an older portrait displayed outside the office, comparing the dignified face in the photograph with the woman now sitting only a few yards away. Time had added silver to her hair and softened a few features, but the unmistakable calm in her eyes remained exactly the same. His heart sank. He whispered under his breath, "It cannot be." Yet the more he looked, the more impossible it became to deny. Daniel remained unaware of every silent realization unfolding around him. He continued explaining departmental policy to another officer who had just arrived to assist with documentation. Restricted government areas require immediate compliance, Daniel said confidently. Nobody receives special treatment. His partner listened carefully, but seemed distracted by the unusual number of senior courthouse officials gathering outside the office. He glanced through the window, then quietly asked, "Do you know who she is?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Someone who refused lawful instructions." The woman finally looked toward the second officer and spoke with remarkable kindness. "Every person deserves to be treated with dignity before conclusions are reached." Her voice carried no anger, only conviction. The younger officer lowered his eyes, visibly uncomfortable. Outside, another government vehicle rolled to a smooth stop beneath the courthouse entrance. Security personnel, who normally maintained relaxed postures, suddenly stood straighter. Conversations ended. Phones disappeared into pockets. Even experienced attorneys paused in mid-sentence as they noticed several members of the governor's executive staff entering the building with deliberate purpose. They moved quickly but without panic, their faces composed, their attention fixed on the same destination. Inside the office, Daniel signed the final page of his report and reached for the folder containing the detention documents. Satisfied with his work, he placed the folder neatly on the desk and prepared to continue the process. At that exact moment, the hallway outside became completely silent. No footsteps echoed. No whispered conversations remained. The entire floor seemed to hold its breath as a distinguished figure approached the office doors, accompanied by senior officials whose presence alone signaled that this ordinary morning had quietly become something far more significant than anyone inside had imagined. The office door opened without anyone announcing the arrival. Every conversation beyond the glass walls disappeared as though the entire courthouse had agreed, without speaking, to surrender the next few moments to silence. Officer Daniel Brooks looked up from the completed report, expecting another administrator or perhaps an attorney with procedural questions. Instead, several members of the governor's executive staff stepped inside, dressed in dark business suits, their expressions calm, yet unmistakably serious. They did not look at Daniel first. Every one of them looked directly toward the woman seated quietly beside the desk. Daniel rose to his feet, maintaining the confidence that had carried him through countless routine investigations. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. No one answered immediately. One senior advisor simply scanned the room before stepping aside. A path opened toward the doorway. Then Governor William Harper entered. His presence transformed the atmosphere instantly. Employees who had gathered outside straightened instinctively. Even seasoned courthouse officials lowered their voices. The governor acknowledged several people with a brief nod before his attention settled on the woman. His expression softened with genuine respect. "Good morning, Justice Carter," he said warmly. "I apologize that I was delayed by traffic." The room became so quiet that the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Daniel stared at the governor, certain he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Justice Carter slowly stood, meeting the governor with the same composed smile she had carried since the beginning of the morning. "Good morning, Governor," she replied. "It appears the day has been more eventful than expected." Governor Harper noticed the handcuffs only after taking another step forward. His expression changed, not to anger, but to disbelief. He paused for a brief moment before looking toward Daniel. "Officer," he asked evenly, "would you explain why Justice Naomi Carter is being detained?" Daniel felt every prepared answer suddenly lose its certainty. "Governor, she entered a restricted area and declined to identify herself during a security inquiry," he replied. His voice remained professional, but the confidence behind it had begun to fade. Governor Harper glanced back toward Naomi. "Did you decline to identify yourself?" She answered calmly. "I asked whether credentials should matter more than respectful treatment." The conversation never moved beyond that question. No accusation, no raised voice, only a quiet statement of fact. Daniel searched the faces around him, hoping someone would confirm that he had followed proper procedure exactly as trained. Instead, he found courthouse officials avoiding eye contact. The veteran bailiff slowly removed his hat, his expression filled with regret. The deputy clerk lowered her head. The younger officer who had assisted with the paperwork quietly stepped backward, suddenly aware that the morning had become something far greater than an ordinary detention. Governor Harper folded his hands for a moment before speaking again. Justice Carter has devoted decades to protecting the Constitution and strengthening public confidence in our legal system. She was invited here this morning to participate in a judicial leadership review attended by members of my administration. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. The report resting on the desk, the completed detention forms, the carefully documented statements, everything that had seemed routine only minutes earlier now felt impossibly heavy. Yet Justice Carter showed no sign of triumph. She looked toward Daniel with the same calm expression that had never left her face. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "every difficult moment offers two choices. One is to defend pride. The other is to discover truth." No one moved. No one interrupted. Outside the office, dozens of people waited in complete silence, realizing they were witnessing the beginning of a lesson that would extend far beyond a single misunderstanding inside one courthouse on an ordinary Monday morning. Daniel Brooks could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, yet none of them spoke. The confidence that had carried him through the morning slowly gave way to something unfamiliar. Doubt. Not because anyone had challenged his authority with anger or humiliation, but because no one seemed surprised by the dignity with which Justice Naomi Carter stood before them. Governor William Harper stepped closer, his voice calm enough to preserve the silence rather than break it. "Justice Carter," he said, "the Judicial Leadership Conference is ready whenever you are, but I believe there is something more important that deserves our attention first." Naomi inclined her head slightly. "There is always time to strengthen public trust," she answered. She then turned toward Daniel, not with resentment, but with a steady expression that invited reflection instead of fear. "Officer Brooks," she said, "may I ask you a question?" Daniel nodded almost automatically. "When you first saw me this morning, what convinced you that I did not belong?" The question landed with unexpected force. Daniel searched for an answer that sounded objective. "You were standing near a restricted corridor without immediately presenting identification," he replied carefully. Naomi listened without interrupting. "And if someone else had been standing in that exact place wearing the same clothes, would your response have been identical?" Daniel hesitated. The office remained perfectly still. The younger officer looked down at the floor. The veteran bailiff folded his hands behind his back. Even the governor remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Daniel opened his mouth before closing it again. He replayed the morning in his mind, remembering how quickly he had reached his conclusion, how little time he had allowed for conversation, and how firmly he had assumed that procedure alone justified every decision. For the first time that day, he wondered whether assumptions had entered the situation long before evidence did. Naomi spoke gently, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent decades weighing difficult questions. "The law asks us to examine facts. Character asks us to examine ourselves." No accusation followed those words. No lecture. Only quiet honesty. Governor Harper glanced toward the courthouse security supervisor. "Have the security recordings from this morning been preserved?" "Yes, Governor," the supervisor answered immediately. "Every camera angle has been secured exactly as recorded." "Good," the governor replied. "Those recordings will help us understand not only what happened, but how it happened." Daniel felt another wave of uncertainty. He had expected the recordings to confirm his actions. Now he realized they would capture far more than paperwork and procedure. They would reveal tone, timing, body language, and every opportunity when a different choice could have been made. Outside the office, word had quietly spread throughout the courthouse. Judges, attorneys, clerks, and visitors gathered respectfully at a distance, not to witness anyone's embarrassment, but because they sensed that something meaningful was unfolding. Justice Carter looked through the glass doors at the growing crowd before returning her attention to Daniel. "Public confidence is not built when officials are perfect," she said softly. "It is built when they are willing to learn." Those words settled over the room with greater power than any raised voice could have carried. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the report resting on the desk. Only minutes earlier it had represented certainty. Now it felt like the beginning of questions he had never imagined asking himself. Governor William Harper looked around the room before speaking again, his voice measured and steady. "No institution earns public trust by pretending. Mistakes never happen," he said. "It earns trust by responding to them with honesty." His words settled over the gathering like a quiet reminder that everyone present, regardless of title or position, served something greater than themselves. Justice Naomi Carter nodded in agreement before turning toward the courthouse security supervisor. "Would you please bring the security recordings into the conference room?" she asked politely. "I would like everyone involved to watch them together." The supervisor immediately agreed, leaving the office with deliberate purpose. Daniel Brooks remained standing beside the desk, unsure whether he should speak or remain silent. For the first time in many years, he realized that experience alone did not guarantee wisdom. The younger officer standing nearby gently placed the completed detention paperwork on the corner of the desk without another word. No one reached for it. The documents that had seemed so important only minutes earlier now appeared insignificant beside the larger questions filling the room. As the group began walking toward the judicial conference room, courthouse employees quietly stepped aside, creating a respectful path. No one whispered now. No one pointed. The atmosphere had changed from curiosity to reflection. Inside the conference room, a large display screen illuminated the front wall. The preserved security footage began playing without commentary. The recording showed the entrance lobby exactly as it had appeared earlier that morning. Justice Carter entered alone, carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. She paused briefly to admire a memorial plaque honoring former judges before continuing toward the restricted hallway. Seconds later, Officer Brooks approached. The recording contained no dramatic music, no narration, and no hidden angles. It simply revealed each decision exactly as it had unfolded. Daniel watched himself speaking confidently before allowing very little time for explanation. He noticed details that had escaped him in the moment. Justice Carter never raised her voice. She never resisted instructions. She maintained respectful eye contact throughout the entire interaction. Several courthouse employees had attempted to approach, but stopped after sensing his determination to conclude the encounter quickly. The video also revealed another important detail. Before any request for identification had fully concluded, Daniel's posture and expression suggested that he had already reached a firm conclusion. The realization settled heavily upon him. Governor Harper paused the recording before turning toward everyone seated around the table. "Facts matter," he said. "So do first impressions." The difficult question is whether those first impressions quietly replaced the facts before the conversation had a chance to develop. No one answered immediately. Justice Carter folded her hands on the conference table and looked toward Daniel with the same calm expression she had shown since the beginning of the morning. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "this meeting was never intended to evaluate only courthouse security. It was designed to examine how public servants make decisions when information is incomplete. Every person in this room, including me, is capable of learning from moments like these." Daniel slowly nodded as he continued watching the frozen image displayed on the screen. For the first time, he saw the encounter not through the certainty of authority, but through the perspective of accountability. The room remained silent, not because anyone expected humiliation, but because genuine understanding often begins in the quiet moments when pride finally steps aside and allows truth to enter. Daniel Brooks remained seated as the frozen image on the conference room screen reflected back at him with uncomfortable clarity. He had watched countless hours of training videos throughout his career, each one explaining the importance of fairness, professionalism, and public trust. Yet none of those lessons had felt as personal as this one. Seeing his own actions unfold without the urgency of the moment stripped away every assumption he had carried into the encounter. The silence in the room was not judgmental. It was reflective. Governor William Harper slowly stood and walked toward the display before turning to face everyone gathered around the conference table. "The law does not ask us to be flawless," he said. "It asks us to pursue justice with humility, because none of us sees every fact in the first moment." Justice Naomi Carter listened carefully before adding her own quiet observation. "Humility is what creates space for truth to enter." Her words carried the weight of decades spent interpreting the Constitution, resolving difficult disputes, and reminding people that justice was never meant to move faster than understanding. Daniel finally looked directly at her. "Justice Carter," he said, speaking more slowly than before, "I believed I was protecting the building. I did not stop long enough to consider whether I was protecting the principles inside it." Naomi offered a gentle nod. "That realization matters more than you know." No applause followed. No dramatic reaction interrupted the moment. The people in the room understood that meaningful change rarely arrived with celebration. It usually arrived with honesty. The courthouse security supervisor placed a folder on the conference table containing visitor logs, event schedules, and authorization records for the judicial conference. Every document confirmed that Justice Carter had been expected that morning. Daniel examined the paperwork carefully. The information had been available all along, yet the opportunity to verify it had been overshadowed by certainty. The younger officer who had assisted with the detention quietly spoke for the first time since entering the room. "We are trained to make quick decisions," he said. "Perhaps we should spend just as much time learning when to slow down." Several officials nodded in agreement. Governor Harper looked around the room before responding. "Good judgment is not measured by how quickly authority is exercised. It is measured by whether every person leaves believing they were treated with dignity." Justice Carter smiled softly. "Respect costs nothing, yet it protects everything the law is meant to preserve." Those words settled deeply into the room. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before taking a careful breath. "I cannot change what happened this morning," he admitted. "But I can choose what happens because of it." Naomi met his gaze with calm sincerity. "That choice belongs to every public servant, every single day." Beyond the conference room windows, the courthouse had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Attorneys resumed their meetings. Clerks carried stacks of files through the hallways. Visitors continued entering beneath the American flag outside the front entrance. Life moved forward, but those who had witnessed the morning understood that something important had changed. The lesson had never been about titles, uniforms, or positions of authority. It had always been about the quiet responsibility carried by every person entrusted to serve others, because justice begins long before a courtroom speaks. It begins in the first decision to see another human being with fairness, patience, and respect. The conference room remained quiet long after the final recording ended. No one hurried to leave. No one reached for their phone or checked the time. The lesson unfolding before them had become far more valuable than the leadership meeting they had originally gathered to attend. Governor William Harper looked around the table, recognizing that every person present had witnessed something impossible to teach through policy manuals alone. "We came here this morning to discuss leadership," he said thoughtfully. "Instead, leadership found us." Justice Naomi Carter smiled gently before standing and walking toward the large windows overlooking the courthouse plaza. Outside, people crossed the sidewalks carrying briefcases, families entered through the front doors for hearings, and school groups waited for guided tours of the historic building. None of them knew what had just occurred inside, yet every one of them depended upon the integrity of the people serving within those walls. Naomi turned back toward the room. "The public does not see every decision we make," she said. "They only experience the consequences. That is why character matters even when no one believes they are being watched." Daniel Brooks remained silent, reflecting on every choice he had made that morning. The certainty he had carried into the building had slowly transformed into something much stronger than confidence. It had become self-awareness. He understood now that authority alone could never create trust. Trust had to be earned through patience, fairness, and the willingness to question one's own assumptions before questioning another person's intentions. The governor nodded toward the courthouse security supervisor. "I would like today's recording incorporated into future professional development programs," he said. "Not as an example of failure, but as an example of why reflection belongs beside procedure." Several department leaders immediately agreed. The younger officer sitting beside Daniel quietly spoke again. "If we only train people to make faster decisions, we eventually create people who forget how to make wiser ones." Justice Carter acknowledged his observation with a grateful smile. "Speed protects buildings," she replied. "Wisdom protects democracy." Those words lingered across the room with remarkable simplicity. The veteran bailiff, who had remained mostly silent throughout the morning, finally cleared his throat. "I recognized your voice before I recognized your face," he admitted. "I almost spoke sooner." Naomi looked at him kindly. "Courage often arrives one moment later than we wish," she answered. "The important thing is that it arrives." Daniel slowly stood from his chair. His uniform looked exactly the same as it had when the day began, yet it no longer felt like a symbol of certainty. Instead, it reminded him of responsibility. "Justice Carter," he said sincerely. "Thank you for showing restraint when you had every reason to be frustrated." She met his words with quiet grace. Respect given during difficult moments is the only kind that truly changes people. Outside the conference room, courthouse operations continued as usual, but conversations throughout the building carried a noticeably different tone. Employees greeted visitors more warmly. Security officers paused longer before making assumptions. Clerks offered clearer explanations to confused families navigating unfamiliar hallways. No official announcement had been made, yet the lesson had already begun spreading through ordinary actions. Sometimes lasting change does not begin with a courtroom ruling or a public speech. Sometimes it begins with one uncomfortable moment honestly examined, one difficult conversation respectfully completed, and one person choosing that tomorrow's decisions will be wiser than yesterday's. Inside that courthouse, the foundations of justice had not changed. The people entrusted to uphold them had. The Judicial Leadership Conference concluded hours later, but the conversations it inspired continued long after the meeting room emptied. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble floors of the courthouse, Justice Naomi Carter prepared to leave through the same front entrance where the morning had taken such an unexpected turn. Governor William Harper walked beside her, thanking her once again for choosing patience over outrage. "You transformed an unfortunate moment into a lesson this institution will remember," he said sincerely. Naomi smiled with quiet humility. "Justice is never measured by how loudly it responds," she answered. "It is measured by how faithfully it protects the dignity of every person." Nearby, Daniel Brooks stood waiting in full uniform. He had requested one final opportunity before the day ended. As Justice Carter approached, he took a respectful step forward. His voice remained steady, but the confidence behind it had changed. It was no longer the certainty of authority. It was the honesty of accountability. "Justice Carter," he said, "I cannot undo this morning, and I will not pretend that intention alone excuses its impact. I allowed my assumptions to move faster than my judgment. For that, I am truly sorry." The entrance hall became completely still. Courthouse employees, attorneys, security officers, and visitors happened to pause within earshot, not because anyone had called for attention, but because genuine humility naturally commands respect. Naomi looked at Daniel for a long moment before answering. "An apology has value when it becomes the beginning of different choices," she said gently. "I believe today can become that beginning." Daniel nodded with sincere gratitude. "It will." The governor extended his hand toward Daniel. "Every public servant will face a defining day," he said. "Your future will not be determined only by today's mistake. It will be determined by what you choose to become after recognizing it." Those words remained with Daniel as Justice Carter accepted the governor's invitation to continue toward the courthouse steps. Outside, reporters covering the judicial conference noticed the officials leaving together, but there was no dramatic announcement, no public spectacle, and no effort to assign blame. Instead, the governor simply spoke about strengthening public trust, improving professional development, and ensuring that every citizen entering a government building would be treated with fairness and respect. Inside the courthouse, the preserved security recording was already being scheduled for future leadership training. Not because it documented the failure of one officer, but because it demonstrated how quickly assumptions can replace understanding when humility is absent. Weeks later, courthouse employees quietly noticed small but meaningful changes. Security officers greeted visitors with greater patience. Verification procedures remained thorough, yet conversations became more respectful. Questions were asked before conclusions were reached. New recruits were reminded that professionalism was measured not only by enforcing rules, but by recognizing the humanity of every individual standing before them. Daniel Brooks became one of the first volunteers to speak during those training sessions. He never minimized what had happened. Instead, he described how easily confidence can become complacency, and how accountability is not the enemy of public service, but its strongest foundation. Justice Naomi Carter continued her work with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout that unforgettable morning, never seeking recognition for the lesson she had taught simply by refusing to surrender her composure. And for everyone who witnessed those events, one truth remained impossible to forget. A badge may grant authority, a title may command respect, But lasting justice begins only when every person is seen before they are judged, because the strongest institutions are not built by perfect people. They are built by people willing to let truth reshape the way they serve.